We're going to be in the Song of Songs today. It's a really interesting little book, a little racy little book. I was amazed when I read this the first time, all the things it had in it, and for that very reason it's caused some controversy in those who interpret the Bible. I think the easiest way for me to proceed in trying to deal with this 8-chapter book in one lesson is to do a brief introduction and then talk about some of the theories and the passages that have caused the most distress. This book in the Hebrew title is called Solomon's Song of Songs. Now, Song of Songs is basically a way of referring to a superlative, the best song. And by Solomon can mean that he wrote it. It can mean in Hebrew it's for him. It can mean it's about him or concerning him. It's a very, very wide Hebrew preposition. And therefore, this title does not assert Solomon's authorship necessarily by itself. In the Latin Bible, it's called Canticles, and it's sometimes known as the Song of Solomon. So it goes by several different names. Under authorship, of course, the traditional authorship has always been Solomon. The Jews say that when Solomon was young, he wrote Song of Songs. When he was middle-aged, he wrote Proverbs. And when he was old and gripey, he wrote Ecclesiastes. I don't think that's true. I think that Solomon is a literary foil in Ecclesiastes, and he may be the literary foil in this book, and I'll show you why I think that. Traditional authorship has always asserted Solomon for several reasons. Let me give you some of the reasons why. In chapter 1, verse 9, it mentions Egyptian horses, and this seems to fit exactly into the historical setting as we understand it, that Solomon was the first to bring Egyptian horses in large numbers into Israel as part of their military machine, and that's 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 28. The name Solomon occurs several times in this book, in chapter 1, verse 1, in chapter 1, verse 5, in chapter 3, verses 7, 9, and 11, and in chapter 8, verse 11 and 12. The little phrase, the king, occurs a couple of times, chapter 1, verses 4, verse 12, and chapter 7, verse 5. The fact that there are geographical places mentioned from the very north of Palestine to the south of Palestine seems to imply a historical setting of a united monarchy. And others say this is another evidence for Solomon. Well, why would you think it's not Solomon then, Bob, you might ask me? Well, there's a couple of things that bother me about the book. If it is an affirmation of the joys of human sexuality, and I think it is, it does seem to imply, though not state specifically, monogamy. It's this young lover and her special lover. That does not seem to fit at all a man that has so many wives and so many concubines as Solomon. Also, this preposition can mean not only by, but for and about and all the rest. I guess one of the problems of authorship is it a unified piece of literature? And by that I mean, is there a plot line? Is there a story that runs throughout these poems? And I must admit to you, there is some difficulty in making all these into one plot line. They seem to be obviously love poems, and there seems to be sometimes they're put together in ways that we don't understand at all. So I must admit I'm just not really certain here. Solomon could be used as a literary foil, as he is in Ecclesiastes, and he certainly could have written this. So I must just kind of plead ignorance on the authorship here. I don't think it has anything to do with inspiration. I think this book is in the canon for a purpose. I think it's God-breathed for a purpose, and I don't think authorship affects that inspiration at all. Now, under a canonization, this book has had a hard time being accepted in the canon, and of course that's probably because of its content. It is part of the writing section of the Hebrew canon. There are three basic sections we call the law, or the Torah, which is Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then we have what's called the prophets. Now, the prophets include what we know in the English Bible as the history books, which would be Joshua through Kings, though not including Ruth, and what we know as the regular prophets, or the latter prophets, which would be Isaiah through Malachi, excluding Daniel. And the third section is the writings. Now, inside the writings is 5 little scrolls that are read on certain feast days. They're called the Megilloth in Hebrew, And Song of Songs is one of those scrolls, and each of these little scrolls is read during a different feast days. Song of Songs is read during Passover. The other books are Ruth and Ecclesiastes and Lamentations and Song of Songs, and one of them is skipped my mind right now. But and they're each read on different days. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you is what kind of a literary genre is this? I think it is obviously wisdom literature. It has a lot of affinity to Proverbs. The wisdom in Proverbs 8 is a woman. We see wisdom personified several times in the early chapter of Proverbs as a woman. And, of course, we have the idea of the feminine speaking here. And some say that's a very important aspect. I really don't see that. But I also want to mention to you that the rabbis have discussed this book a lot. Exactly when the Old Testament canon was closed, there's been some debate. The church pretty much accepted the Jewish canon, but we know from some writings after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, a group of rabbis, Pharisees, moved to a city called Jamnia, and we have some of their writings from Jamnia where they discuss some of these disputed books. And Song of Songs is one of these disputed books. This book was opposed by the Rabbinical school of Shammai, but was upheld by the Rabbinical school of Hillel. As a matter of fact, one of the leaders of this Jamnia group is Rabbi Akiba. And I want to read you what he said about this book. Listen to this. For all the world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. Whoa! Isn't that a strong affirmation by Rabbi Akiba? Now, some have said that it was accepted because the traditional interpretation was allegory, meaning this book was basically God's love for Israel, is how it got into the Jewish canon. And I can certainly see that was the way that some of these rabbis interpreted it, though I'm not sure that Rabbi Akiba interpreted it this way, and we just can't say a whole lot more about that at this point. It is a book that affirms sexuality. The Jews were, although their language was very precise, they talked a lot about the human body that we would feel uncomfortable about sometimes in the Old Testament. They did not expose the human body much. Their dressing was very, what word should I use? Very traditional. They covered their bodies. They didn't show parts of their bodies or accentuate parts of their bodies in their clothing. Now, since the book is in the canon, there's been several theories about how to interpret this. I think it'd be easier for me to go over some of these theories and then kind of react to them. There's always been this Jewish allegory view. Now, this is part of the Talmud, and the Aramaic Targums interpret it this way. Basically, they see this as a book that can't refer to human sexuality only. Because of its place in the canon, they would say that it is the anthropomorphic allegory of God's love for Israel. Now, there is some ideas, and here there are some words that are used, the word dove and lily and things like that, that seem to be words that are used for Israel as a whole. But I'm just so against allegory because I believe you can make the Bible say anything if you don't take it in the original authorial intent. And since allegory cuts off the original historical setting and cuts off the original authorial intent, I have real problems with this being simply an anthropomorphic, metaphorical expression of God's love for Israel. I think there would have to be an introduction and a conclusion that express that to allow me to interpret these love poems in that allegorical fashion. Now, the church, as you know, was dominated by allegory for the first 1,000 years. And, of course, some bright lights of that would be Origen and Jerome and Athanasius and Augustine. They all affirmed Christian allegory. They would say this is basically God's love through Christ for the church. And they would pick up on things like Ephesians, where the church is the bride of Christ, and things like that. Also, Thomas Aquinas, the main theologian of the Catholic Church, during the Middle Ages, as well as the Protestant reformer Martin Luther believed this was an allegory about God's love through Christ for the church. One thing I do feel comfortable with and think we have to take this into consideration is my view that we have to compare the literary genre or literary form with other forms in its day. And we know that wisdom literature was a very common kind of literature in the ancient Near East. We have a lot of wisdom literature from Mesopotamia, the Tigris, Euphrates, river valleys, a lot from Egypt, a lot from Phoenicia. And it is one of these Phoenician kinds of literature that I think this song has much in common with. It's usually called the Syrian, and I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce this, W-A-S-P-S. It's a kind of a wedding song, and basically what it is for a week, their weddings went on for a week, the bride and groom would sing or say poems to each other. The bride would be called the queen, and the groom would be called king during this week of wedding songs. And some say that's how the king and queen idea got in here. Let me just let you open your Bible to Song of Songs chapter 1, and let me show you how this would kind of divide itself out. We would have the bride saying to the groom, and the groom saying back, and the crowd of wedding guests speaking. In chapter 1, it would break down like this. Verse 2 through verse 4b would be the bride. Verse 4c through 4e would be either a chorus, or some would say Solomon's harem, or in this particular example, be the wedding guest. Then verses 5 through 7 would be the bride. Verse 8 would be the chorus, or the harem, or the wedding guest. Verse 9 and 10 would be the bridegroom. Verse 11 would be the chorus. Verse 12 through 14, the bride. Verse 15, the bridegroom. And verse 16 and 17, the bride again. And my Bible is kind of divided up into paragraphs that follow this form. And some say this Phoenician wedding songs, some take it back as ancient as 600 BC period, seems to be the kind of literary genre that these love poems are following. Now, we don't know if the Jews had the same kind of customs as the Syrians. They have different backgrounds. And so no one can be certain about that. But I do think that fits a lot of the genre setting of this book. Now, some say it's a drama. And what do they mean by a drama? Well, I'm a little nervous about this because we know nothing of drama from ancient Jewish literature. But they would say there are actors in this. And what we have is a set of actors, a definite plot line going through the whole book. And they would see three main characters. And this changes the perspective of the book tremendously. If you just read the book, it seems to be a young woman and the king, apparently. But this says there is a young country girl from the north and a young country man from the north who fell in love. And Solomon came through on his royal caravan and saw this beautiful young girl and took her for his harem and tried to woo her love away from this country boy. But her love was faithful to her lover back home, and she would not succumb to Solomon's overtures, and finally he let her go home. Now that solves some problems in the book, but I want to tell you that causes a whole lot of more problems because you don't see this necessarily in the way this is written. You've got to kind of surmise her saying this for a boyfriend back home, or her saying this to Solomon. So although I think I'm attracted to that to solve some of the other problems in the book, I just don't think I can go with that. I guess I feel most comfortable with what's known as the human love theory. And this, of course, was put out by the school of Antioch, which is called the literal school or the historical-grammatical school. It developed in the 3rd century in reaction to the allegorical school of interpretation. The early church started in Alexandria, Egypt, by people like Clement of Alexandria and Origen. It's this allegory that dominated most of the church. But there was a group that reacted against this, and they wanted to take the Bible in its literal sense, in its surface meaning, in its historical context. And Theodore of Mopsuestia is one of those. Now, he was called a heretic by the church councils because he said that this book affirms human sexuality. And I think of all these theories, whatever more it means, I think it has to mean that. that this is the book in the Bible that affirms that human sexuality is not something evil or nasty or just part of the fall, that human sexuality is something to be rejoiced in, something to be spoken of in public, something to be advocated to our young people in its proper time and proper place. It is one of the greatest gifts of God. It was God's idea. God is the one who thought of and implemented sexuality to show us our need for another human being and to show us the fulfillment that can come in interpersonal relationships. And so I want to say that I think even if it does have an allegorical element, it has to have, I think, this basic affirmation of the wholesomeness, the joy, the purity, and the divine plan of human sexuality. And I hope I can affirm that to you. I don't know how we got so nervous in the church about talking about sexual things between a man and a wife. I think if we talked more about them, rejoiced in them more, had more marriage enrichment conferences, and allowed people to speak about this more, would have much less failures in Christian marriages. And it appalls me that we are so uncomfortable in speaking about this. The last one is, some say it's a parable, and by parable they're trying to say that it tries to combine this literal aspect and the allegorical aspect. I'm drawn to that. I think the fact that it's in the Bible, and God is often spoken in anthropomorphic terms. We know He's not a man, but we use human terms to describe Him. We know that He does use human sexuality as a way to describe His love for His people. We see that in Hosea chapters 1 through 3, where God is a young, passionate lover and Israel is a faithless wife. We see it in the beautiful passage in Ephesians 5, where the church, its relationship to Christ, is described as a bride and a groom. And so I certainly understand that God takes the most meaningful, emotional things in our life and says to us, I'm like that. I love you like that. I feel for you like that. And certainly I think that the other precedents in the Bible show us that's a possibility. But again, I want to say, I think it looks like the literary climax of the book is in chapter 8, verses 6 and 7, that affirms human sexuality. Let me read that passage with you. Put me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death, and jealousy as severe as Sheol. The very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, they would be utterly despised. Now you can see the affirmation and the depth, the passion of human love. And that's why it's something that I think God has to talk about positively, is because men have so twisted this God-given human emotion and human desire into perverted ways that destroy instead of build up. And yet the moment I say that to you, I want you to just look at chapter 8 and all the difficulty we have in trying to make sense of this. Look at chapter 8, just look at verse 5, about verse 5c. Beneath the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she was in labor and gave you birth. Now what does 5 have to do with 6? And look at verse 8, right in the middle of all this. We have a little sister, and she has no breast. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? Now, how does that fit? I mean, it's for the life of me, I could not outline this book. It looks to me like we have some love poems that were brought together to affirm human sexuality, that Solomon is the literary foil because of his famous many wives and his apparent physical passion. And yet I feel uncomfortable saying that because I just feel like this book affirms more. I'm really kind of caught in a bind and don't know quite how to get out of it. I would like to speak to some of these other difficult passages that I think have caused me a lot of trouble as I've gone through this. The worst of them is chapter 5, verse 7. Would you turn over there with me? This makes no sense of any of the things that we've been talking about. And here is where we're not sure if the young girl has for some reason put off Solomon's advances and then feels bad and then goes try to find him. And yet when she tries to find him, she's either trying to break into his secret apartment, not secret, but private apartment, or she's running through the city looking for him, and a night watchman finds her. And look at verse 7. The watchman who makes the rounds in the city found me. They struck me and wounded me. The guardsmen on the walls took away my shawl from me. What is that all about? That's not a love poem. What is that doing in here? You say, well, it shows a historical setting. Yes, but what historical setting? Was she trying to run back to her northern boyfriend? Was she trying to find Solomon? What is someone from the harem doing out in the streets of Jerusalem? It just doesn't make sense. Some other different ones are chapter 2, verse 15. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that are ruining the vineyards while our vineyards are in blossom. Now, there have been a million allegorical interpretations about the little foxes. But in context, there's no way to know, really. Are these little problems that destroy the marriage, little problems that causes your love to die? Or is it foxes who destroy the fields? I must admit, I just do not know. Here are some other ones. Well, that'll work. You see the problems that this book has. Let's talk about what this book does affirm. It affirms the beauty of the human body. Graphically, in metaphors that apply to Israel, the girl's body is described and the boy's body. Now let's look at chapter 4, where he talks about the girl's body. Now these are some strange metaphors. They kind of make you want to giggle. How beautiful are you, my darling, how beautiful are you. Your eyes are like a dove's behind a veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats at the descent of Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes. Now, of course, this is sheep that have been just sheared, therefore they're very white, and they're coming over a green hill. He's trying to say that she has pretty white teeth. I wonder if I'm sure she picked up on this. Your lips are like a scarlet thread. Your temples like a pomegranate. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with rows of stones, on which are hung 1,000 shields. This woman's got a big neck, or we're talking about a bracelet and a slender neck some way. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that feed among the lilies. Well, this is a deformed woman, or it's got to be two deer with their heads bent down in tall lilies, and all you can see is the hump of their back. This is the kind of... I remember the first time I read this, I thought, wow, what a Bible passage this is. The guy is described over here in the end of chapter 5. He's described as being dazzling and ruddy, which means kind of red, sunburned maybe. His head is like gold, pure gold. His locks are like a cluster of dates, as black as a raven. Curly-haired boy. His eyes are like doves behind streams of water, bathed in milk. And, of course, what they're saying is the whites of his eyes are white, and his eyes, show off in that. His cheeks are like a bed of balsam. The one that always tickles me is his abdomen is like inlaid rods of gold, inlaid with sapphires. His legs are like pillars of alabaster. Well, you can tell the wild things they're talking about and how they just think of each other and describe each other and long to be together. And that matches the feelings we've all had. One of these famous songs we sing in Vacation Bible School a lot, His Banner Over Me is Love, comes from chapter 6, verse 4. And others have noted that in chapter 6, verse 4 is this northern city that became the capital of the north before King Omri built Samaria. And the fact they're mentioned here along with Jerusalem shows that we're in a united period and not later than that. Let's see. Chapter 7, I always like to mention in verse 2, it says, your navel is like a round goblet which never lacks mixed wine. I tell my kids at school that, the Bible is true and what it says we have to do. And this talk about drinking wine out of your wife's navel. But since we're Baptists, we don't use wine. We use grape juice. Of course, that means the big question we have to ask the girl we marry is, to really be biblical, she has to have an innie and not an outie, or we got all kinds of trouble here. Well, I think that's about all I can do with this book for you. I hope you'll read the whole book through. The lesson covers just a couple of isolated chapters, but it's only 8 chapters. And like all of these wisdom literature books, they need to be dealt with as a whole. And I think as you read it as a whole, you'll begin to ask yourself, now what is the central plot here? And that's what's difficult to discern. It's obvious that the truth is that human sexuality is good and wholesome and God-given and affirmed. This book is in the canon of inspired books. Is there more to this book? That God loves us with this sexual kind of intensity? Yes, I think we can affirm that, though there's nothing in the book itself, and no introduction, no close, that leads us to that. It's just knowing that God does say, I want to explain myself to you by using common human experiences. In that sense, we can see the allegorical or spiritualizing nature of this book. But I want to say I think it affirms human sexuality, and I think the church needs to hear that, especially in our day of when the number of homes that break up of non-believers is pretty much the same percentage as the number of homes that break up who are believers. Somehow we're just not dealing with this wonderful aspect of marital sexuality, which I think is a God-given gift and is meant to bond us together and hold us together and help us affirm one another. So it's a powerful motive, and God expresses it here to us and gives us other guidelines of how to deal with it in our life. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.